My name's Greg Prieto. I'm an associate professor of sociology here at the University of San Diego. I'm in my 7th year of teaching, and I am pleased to talk with you today about my book called Myth and Reality in the U.S. Immigration Debate. And this book is meant to be a short and accessible primer on the facts and the myths that surround the U.S. immigration debate. And the goal is to give the reader a sense of the empirical reality of immigration so that they can enter the debate with both facts and with heart. So it's a short 80 pages, but the chapters are short. They're meant to be readable. You could read the whole book together or just read the chapters a la carte. And the idea is to take you through what I think are the essential dimensions of the U.S. immigration debate. So it opens with a chapter about how we think about immigration as either an enforcement problem or as a public policy problem. Then it moves into a chapter about history. There's a chapter about myth versus fact. We look at the 3 big myths surrounding the immigration debate, whether immigrants commit more crime than the US born, their impact on wages, and their impact on local and state budgets. There is a chapter about one of its key themes, which I call the legal production of illegality. And the goal is to understand how undocumented immigration specifically is not just a result of the choices of individual migrants, but is also the outcome of the collective political choices that we've made as a national community. And no surprise, as we've constricted the avenues for legal migration to this country, undocumented immigration has mushroomed. And then the final chapter really tackles the question of whether people are objecting to immigration because they misunderstand the facts. So throughout the entire book, I assume that people will be swayed by the empirical research. But the last chapter really addresses the racial overtones that influence the debate. And so what it looks at is the way that the US born in an experimental setting make choices about who's deserving and undeserving, not on the basis of qualifications, work experience, language, but on the basis of race. And if this is a country that is about opportunity and justice for all, I offer some ways that we could think through the moral conundrums that allowing the immigration debate to go unresolved have created for migrant communities in the United States and around the world. So my first book, Immigrants Under Threat, was really my research, and that was an ethnography of 2 Mexican migrant communities on California's Central Coast. This book is really more secondary in its analysis. So it's a roundup of all of the foundational, but also the cutting-edge social science, history, economics, literature that's out there on the immigration question. The real service that I see this book doing is not contributing any new insights to the debate, but really rounding them up and making them much more accessible for a broader audience. And so this is a pathway into the kinds of insights and information that have long existed within sociology, history, economics, critical race theory, that the broader public does not typically have access to or the opportunity to read. So I see this as more standing on the shoulders of the scholars that have come before me, but to offer a concise and clear way to think about the immigration debate that is both grounded in empiricism, but also in history and a collective sense of morality. So I imagine there are a couple of audiences that would be able to use this book. So I'm thinking about undergraduates in a course in a week or 2 weeks. If you want to cover the topic of immigration, this would be a great place to start. If you're a graduate student trying to get a handle on the broader field of immigration, I think this book would be a great place to start. But I think it's also meant to be read by a broader audience. So I think this is exactly the kind of book that you could slide across to a relative at the Thanksgiving dinner table or during the holidays. This is the kind of book that would be ideal when you're sitting in an airport waiting for your flight to take off. That this is meant to make the insights that typically stay siloed within the academy accessible to a broader audience. So I think I was interested initially in my first book for 2 reasons. One is personal and the other is political. Personally, I'm Mexican-American and white, and the Mexican-American heritage in my family was something I was interested in knowing more about. So in learning about the immigration experience to this country, I'm also learning about what my own relatives and ancestors went through in coming to the United States. So I think that's the personal piece. But I think the bigger piece for me is really political and service-oriented. So when I got to college, one of the first big transformations in my life was thinking about not just how to advance myself, right, but to be of service to my broader community. And ever since that college experience, I have sought out those opportunities. So when I got to graduate school, one of the first things that I did was look for places in the community where I could do work, where I could engage in activism. And in the course of doing that, I got involved in a number of different groups who were trying to support the immigrant community in California, right? Both the broader immigrant community, but specifically the undocumented community. And so when I was thinking about dissertation projects that really got to the central question that I cared about, which was inequality in our social world, immigration seemed like a natural place to go because it was tied to the community and activist work that I was already doing. So that's how I came to the first project. But this book, as I said, is really meant to be for a broader audience. And the reason that I decided to take that on as a second project is because, one, I wasn't seeing a lot of text like this out there. But two, I thought that this is one of the ways that I could make my scholarship of use to the broader community that I'm a part of. And so when I wrote my first book, a lot of the insights in there will not come as a surprise to the community that I was trying to address. The immigrant folks that I was working with every day would not be at all surprised by the kinds of things I wrote about in that book. But I think that there is a utility to this book that's meant for a broader audience. And I think it stems from the fact that this is information that a lot of US citizens don't always know about. And it's information that I think might be particularly useful to folks as they come into the next election. Immigration is a hot button topic. It has been long before this administration. And so I think arming people with clear and concise knowledge about the actual effect of immigration on US society is critical so people can make informed choices in November and beyond. So I think what really motivated me in this second book project was taking the broader insights of my field and making them of use to a broader community, which I think kind of echoes my pathway through education and into my scholarship. The first is the myth of crime, that immigrants commit more crime than the US born. That's not true. That's not been true for the last 20 or 30 years of research. And that's the case because of something we call Latino revitalization. And this is the notion that Latino immigrants, whom we would expect to commit higher levels of crime given the neighborhoods that they settle into, don't. And the reasons that they don't are multifaceted, but they include things like when immigrants come to the United States, they tend to live in two-parent households. They tend to set up community institutions that keep young people from getting into trouble. This includes everything from churches all the way down to soccer teams. People, when they live in multi-generational households, mean that you have multiple adult eyes on you at all times, and that helps you keep on the straight and narrow. And then I think the other big thing that helps is when immigrants settle in communities that are welcoming, that facilitate their integration through community programming and through city services. This all plays a role in keeping people from criminal activity, which is not an expression of people's bad feelings or bad intentions, but are really a response to concentrated poverty in the neighborhoods where they live. So I think that's the first myth that we can scuttle, is that immigrants commit more crime than native born. I think you could say the same thing about wages. We have very little evidence that immigrants have any negative wage impact on the wages of the US born, but where we do see a negative impact, it's typically limited to the group that immigrants sometimes compete with, and that is the US-born folks who didn't complete high school. It's a small group, but it's also a group in which African Americans or blacks are overrepresented. So there's a real issue there, but the issue again is small. If you're looking to explain why US wages have stagnated over the last 40 years, immigration really doesn't explain very much of that puzzle. Neoliberalism, offshoring, automation do, but immigration doesn't. And so when we think about wages, I think immigration is hardly the catastrophe that it's often made out to be in mainstream electoral politics. But on the question of taxes, I think this is the biggest one. And this is where we see often, I think, the most manipulation in the data. If we focus on the federal picture, we see a positive fiscal impact. And this is because immigrants contribute through payroll taxes to large federal programs like Social Security, but they can't claim those benefits later on in their life. At the state and local level, they impose more of a tax burden, largely because they use more resources than they contribute through education, right? Their kids get educated, but because the immigrants that I focus on in this book are not high-wage earners, they typically contribute less in taxes than they take off the system in the form primarily of education. But when we add all of those together and we look at not just immigrants when their children are living in the home, but when they leave the home and set up their own households and then earn their own money, we see a really different picture. And we see that over the course of their lifetimes and across not just the first but into the second generation, we see that immigrants contribute more in taxes than the US born do. That's a really different picture than most people get. And what that has to do with is not what immigrant folks themselves are doing, but really has to do with the way that researchers decide to present that data to the broader public. So if we focus narrowly on the household when those children are in it, we get a negative picture. But when we focus on the entire lifetime that we know matters for thinking about taxes, because all of us have been burdens or boons at different times in our life, right? When I was a young person going to public school and not working, I was a burden on the tax system. But we don't call that a burden, we call that an investment. Right? I think we should extend that same consideration to immigrants. So when we look over the course of the lifetime and we think about multiple generations, we see a very positive tax picture, and indeed a more positive picture than we have for the US born. I think that's information that would be really useful to folks that are out there thinking about the impact of immigration on US society. And I think it really contrasts with the picture that we just got about President Trump's taxes out of this New York Times article. In a lot of ways, we could say that undocumented folks pay more taxes than the president does. And what that really reorients us to is to where tax deficits come from. If you're looking to generate more tax revenue, you're not going to get that much out of immigrant folks, though interestingly, it would help if we created an amnesty program that would actually contribute to capturing more of those tax dollars. If you really want to deal with the question of taxes in the United States, I think you are looking at tax avoidance among the wealthy and among corporate America. There was a study that came out from I think it was Larry Summers, several years ago, and he tried to estimate the amount of tax that was avoided over the period from 20 and then estimating forward to 2029. So 2020 to 2029, he found over $700 trillion in taxes could have been collected over that same period, right? If people paid their full tax burden every year. So when I think about who is draining our local, state, and our federal coffers, I don't think about immigrants. As I've said, they have a positive impact over the course of their life. I think about those parties that are most responsible for tax deficits in the United States, and those are the wealthy and corporate America. I think the very first thing folks who have questions about what immigration means for this upcoming election should do is simply start with the question, where is the information that I'm using to make that choice coming from? And I think too often we rely on the pundit class, we rely on politicians who are interested not in addressing in an accurate way the impact of immigration on society, but instead are interested in leveraging immigrants to drive a particular kind of American resentment that might lead people to the polls. So the first thing I would ask people to do is think about where their information comes from in the first place. And what I would suggest is that we turn off the news, we turn off Twitter, and we look for sources that can show us in a reliable and an evidence-based way what the impact of immigration is on US society. This book is one place to start, but the references section in here, all of the little discussion sections, the footnotes are chock full of lots of other resources from scholars and from advocates that reflect to us an accurate vision of the impact that immigrants have on US society. And I think a picture begins to emerge that doesn't often show up on the news, that doesn't often show up on social media, and I think it comes to one of the key themes in this book, that immigrants aren't just takers, in terms of crime, in terms of wages, in terms of fiscal impacts, but they are contributors, that they offer a lot to our society, and not just to our economy, but to those neighborhoods where they settle. And so I think that brings us to the second thing that folks can do. One, ask yourself where you're getting information from, and try to seek out sources that are more reliable and that are especially evidence-based. I think the second thing folks can do is get to know the immigrant folks that are in your social world. And we know that they're there, they often just go ignored. So is there someone, immigrant folks are concentrated in a number of industries that we already know about, right? Agriculture, food processing, hospitality. There are immigrants all around us all the time. They clean our homes, they care for our children and our elderly, they serve us food, they make sure that the US agricultural system continues to flow. There are lots of opportunities for everyday folks to get to know immigrants in your communities, right? There are neighbors, they play on our sports teams, they attend our churches. And so what I'd encourage people to do is to actively seek out those relationships, form meaningful connections with immigrant folks in your community. Because what happens when you do that is you stop seeing immigrants as just a factor or a variable in an equation or just a number in a set of statistics that you're bombarded with all of the time in the news media. You begin to see the whole person. And when you begin to see the whole person, you see the fullness of what they offer to our communities and to our economy. You see that folks are raising children here because they are highly motivated to succeed in life and to give their children a better opportunity. I think that's something that folks that were born in this country can relate to. I think you begin to see that people want to contribute. They want to do good in the world. They volunteer. They participate on political campaigns. They go to PTA meetings and they participate in parent groups. They do all of the kind of stuff that everyday Americans do all of the time. And when we begin to see those commonalities, we start to see immigrants as contributors and not just as threats. And I think that's the critical shift that we have to make before the election. And that is the sort of the heart work or the emotional or personal work that has to happen and that a book like this can't do on its own. A book like this is great for separating the fact from the fiction, but there's another piece that I think all of us need, which is that human connection, that personal link. And when we do that, we begin to be able to mobilize the insights of this book in our everyday life. The facts put us on the path, but I think what gets us to walk down that path are those connections with migrant folks themselves. And I'd encourage people to approach, see, connect with immigrant folks who are already in their everyday life, who they might just pass over right now. And I think it's that relationship that's really going to make the shift in our politics around immigration in this country. Well, I think separate from the two parties, I think there is a myth, the most powerful one, that traffics for truth all the time, traffics as truth all of the time. This is the myth that immigrants commit more crime than the US born. This is patently false. It's been false over the 30 years of research that demonstrates that fact. It's false today. It has been false back in pre-1965 when the waves of migrants to this country were primarily European, and it's false today now that waves of migrants to this country are predominated by Asians and Latinos. I think that is the number one myth we hear all of the time, and I think it is the one that is most easily debunked. And it's debunked because we can simply look at incarceration rates. We can look at survey data that asks people to self-report any criminal activity in a given year. We can look at prison data. We can also look at community studies where we study an entire city and we compare the rates of criminality in one community in that city to the native born in that city. And we still see, no matter what the research approach is, that immigrants commit less crime than the native born. And it's because of those institutions that I flagged earlier. It's because they have regular work, regular employment to take care of. They have families with two parents in them, usually multiple generations, which contribute to keeping young people on the straight and narrow. These are the kind of factors that help us explain that fact, but I think that's myth number one, is that immigrants commit more crime. Not true today, hasn't been true this entire time. I think the big takeaway here is that immigration is a problem of policy and not of people. In the immigration debate in the United States, it's almost always framed in terms of the bad decisions that individual immigrants have made or not made. What we don't see when we stay focused on that narrow question are the ways that our collective political choices as citizens have constrained in a tremendous way the opportunities to come to this country legally. So one of the things we hear all the time that I hear from my own family members is, if my ancestors could come to this country the right way, maybe in the 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, then immigrants today can. And what they don't realize when they say something like that is that after 1965, the pathways for coming to this country get much, much narrower. And there's a reason for that, and that's because we instituted a per-country cap. We said, to be fair to the global community, when we abandoned the national origin system that predominated from 1924 to 1965 and was explicitly racist, we said, okay, we're gonna be fair. The way we're gonna be fair, we're gonna give everybody the same number of visas, approximately 25,000 visas a year. That's great if you're coming from a country that has very little immigration to the United States, a country like Belgium or France. But if you're coming from one of the top 4 sending countries to the United States, China, the Philippines, India, and Mexico, your wait times to come to this country are decades long. That was a political choice we made as a country all the way back in 1965, and we are living with the consequences of those artificially constrained pathways into the United States today. That's something that never comes into the immigration debate, at least not the ones that I see on TV and on social media. That's something that I want everybody who picks up this book to think about, is not just whether immigrants made a bad choice in coming to this country with or without documents, but how we as a country have limited the opportunities to come to the United States at all. Presently on the border, there's almost no opportunity for refugees and asylees to come into the United States, violating a long-standing tradition of humanitarianism that's been with us since at least World War II. That's a choice that we made as a collective community. And if that's true, it's also a choice that we can unmake. And so what I hope this book does is return to us the power to remake our immigration policy in light not just of a tradition of humanitarianism, but in light of the facts that immigrants are not just takers, but they're also contributors. And when we do that, all of a sudden the prospect of reform, of amnesty, is not this scary, unprecedented thing, but is actually a normal part of the political process of not just excluding or stopping immigration, but regulating it in a fair way. And I think we can do that when we do 2 things, which is 1, understanding the fact of the matter, but then 2, understanding our role in making it harder. And as I've said, since 1965, but all the way into the present, making it harder for immigrants to come to this country legally at all. I think we're living through a moment of tremendous social upheaval, and it's around race, but more specifically, it's around racism. And it's around the ongoing reality of racism shaping the lives, not just of African Americans, which has been front and center as it should be in the Black Lives Matter movement, but racism as it impacts every corner of US society. And it's certainly impacted the debate on immigration. And I think the effect that racist rhetoric has had on the debate is to keep us from having a debate at all. What racism doesn't allow us to do is to think about immigrants as full people. It doesn't allow us to approach the facts. It doesn't really describe even what immigrants are doing or what impact they're having on US society. What I think racism does is really an articulation of anxieties about demographic changes that many white Americans have about immigrants. So when I think about what racism is and the role it plays in this debate, I think it has less to do with actually describing immigrants themselves and more to do with expressing particular white anxieties about the impact that immigrants are having. And as I've said in this book, immigrants are contributors. And they're contributors not just because I want that to be true, but because the social science bears that out. So when we take that piece away, when we kind of settle that question, what are we left with? And I think what we're left with is just anxiety about what it means that our country is becoming both browner and blacker, right? And those anxieties are ones that this country has been struggling with since its founding and before. So when I think about what the role of racism is in this debate and how we respond to it, I think about this not as a new problem, but it's one that's been with us for a long time. But because that's true, it means we have ready answers for this problem. When we set the racism aside, when we get to know immigrant people, as contributors, as full members of our community, we see that these folks are not the murderers and rapists that they are sometimes made out to be. We see them as contributors, as real people. And I think that shifts the debate. All of a sudden, we're not talking about these fantastical threats that they represent to us, but how we support the newest group of Americans as they enter our society. That's a really different project. So when we let go of the anxieties about what it means for our communities to change, when we let go of these old ideas that immigrants aren't deserving because they're culturally different, because they look different, because they speak a different language, right? These are anxieties we've had for a long time. And when we let those go, all of a sudden, there's a lot more space in the debate for a humane and evidence-based discussion about how we best regulate immigration to this country and support our newest group of Americans. So what led me to choose this image was not just that I had the opportunity to work with this young person when I was doing my graduate research back in the day. But I thought it was a really powerful image of one of the book's central themes, that immigrants are contributors. And you see it represented really powerfully on the cover. Here you have two migrant farm workers from Mexico standing in a strawberry field in Central California with their daughter between them. And she's wearing her graduation regalia when she graduated from UCLA. She's since gone on to complete her master's degree at Brown and now teaches back in that same home community in Santa Maria, California, where she's raising up the next generation. And I thought, what a powerful image of the way that migrants contribute over the course of the generations. And the story that it represents of generational sacrifice, of doing everything that a parent and a family member would do to make sure that that child succeeds, is something that would resonate with families all across the United States, because isn't that exactly what all of our families are doing, right? Setting up the next generation. And I couldn't think of a more powerful image of that intergenerational mobility than this young UCLA grad in her regalia with the stole, with the cords, standing in a strawberry fields where her parents have worked for decades. What an image of the way that the sacrifices of one generation manifest as contributions in the next. I can't think of a more American story than that. So when it came to choosing the cover, this one made the most sense. And interestingly enough, as I went through the process of securing permissions to use the image, it turns out the photographer was himself another of the same youth that worked in that community organization that I was in way back in graduate school. And so between the two of them, there was this really neat full circle moment where their own contributions as the children of immigrants not only inspired my work at that time, what I was describing at the top of the interview, but also continue to inspire my scholarship today. And you see it there on the cover. When I talk to people about the US immigration debate, they kind of get a little down about it because we haven't had any successful reform legislation in at least 30 years. And what that tells us is there may not be a lot of room for new reform legislation going forward. So where is there room in US society to make a change, and to make a positive change that incorporates as opposed to excludes immigrant folks? And I think in the absence of political opportunity at the federal level, we look to the state and the local level to see where we can take action that allows us to support the immigrant community. So let me give you a few examples. The first one comes from California, and I think California has been a real leader in integrating its immigrant residents into the broader state population. One of the ways that they've done this is through what's called the Trust Act. One of the big shifts in immigration enforcement starting after 9/11 was really to not make it just a federal thing, but really to bring state and local actors into the work of federal immigration enforcement. We see that in programs like Secure Communities, where now if you're booked into a local jail, your fingerprints aren't just sent to the FBI, but they're also sent to ICE or Immigration and Customs Enforcement. We also see that in much more mundane ways here at the local level. Local police are often pulling over, or at least they were in in the time I was writing this book, they would pull over immigrants for not having driver's licenses. Well, they couldn't get a driver's license in the first place. There's new legislation on the book, AB 60, that allows them to do so. So those enforcement transformations meant that everyday risk in the lives of immigrant folks started to grow. So what did California do? They passed the Trust Act. The Trust Act created a firewall between federal immigration enforcement and local immigration enforcement. And what it recognized substantively was that local police cannot cultivate the relationships of trust with their immigrant communities if they fear that they'll be deported for doing things like reporting crime, cooperating in a criminal investigation, or in the case of domestic violence survivors, reporting their abuser. These are all things that genuinely imperil public safety. And so some local enforcement agencies understood that, and the Trust Act created that firewall and allowed local police to focus on the work that they really care about, which is creating genuine public safety. So I think that's one example of the way that states can make a huge difference in the everyday lives of immigrant folks. One of the other ways that we see it is here at the local level. Here in San Diego, the Welcoming San Diego initiative was designed to draw attention to, but also to collect resources to settle the newest members of the San Diego community, whether they're refugees or immigrants. We recently hired a new immigrant integration coordinator whose job it is to do that work at the city level. And that connects back to that Latino revitalization effect that I talked about earlier that helps us explain why immigrants who settle into neighborhoods that are beset by concentrated poverty, how do they end up not committing more crime? Well, this is part of the reason. Where we offer them support around education, healthcare, housing, and employment, people are able to marshal the resources they need to stay on the straight and narrow path and to support their children in doing so. So even here in San Diego, we see that there's a lot of work that can be done to make sure that immigrants have the opportunities that all San Diegans have. And when we do that work, we set them up to become the contributors that I know that they are and that this book demonstrates that they are.